Hey, what is going on, everyone? Today, I'm just going to take a little bit to stream, and I'm going to edit this video later. And today, we're going to be watching a commentary that just got put out about bad Christian movies and apparently good Christian movies. And I personally think that we are going through a time right now where Christian movies are finally starting to be okay, and some are actually like phenomenally good. Like I've been watching The Chosen, for the last couple years, and it's been like amazing. Maybe I'll make a video later complaining about some of the things I wish they did differently. But I mean, the production value of Christian movies has gotten so better. The writing has gotten so better. The characters and some of the struggles they go through in the plots, it's way better than the cookie cutter that it used to be when I was growing up. That made me hate watching Christian movies. Made me actually be very almost against companies like PureFlix and Great American sometimes because of some of the awful stuff that they were putting out. But let's watch this video because I'm interested to see what some of y'all may think.
Hey, Scotty. Jesus, man.
Dear Christian filmmakers, stop forcing the gospel into every scene. A common misconception among Christian artists is that preachy art qualifies as good art. This is far from the truth. Today, I'll discuss the glaring issue with our current approach to art and what actual Christian art should look like. I'll break down 3 examples of painfully preachy films, but stick around because near the end, I'll show you one Christian film that actually nails it. Most Christian artists are mistaken in thinking that being a good Christian means putting Bible verses and references to Jesus.
You see, this actually reminds me to a debate that happened back in the day, not with film, but actually with music. There was a Christian artist, he's still around, named Lecrae, and he was being criticized because he began to not want to be known as a Christian rapper, but as a rapper who was Christian. And he actually started to do projects that on the face seemed more secular, and also started to partner and be friends with secular artists, but he never once denied his faith, never once stepped back on what he had talked about or what he'd rapped about before. So this is actually a debate that's been going on for a long time. If we do Christian film or Christian music, does it always have to be super preachy? Does it always have to have the Bible in reference to it? And I think there's an interesting conversation to have about that. But I'm going to go on the video a little more and see how else it talks about it.
In every story they write. Not only is that not how good stories are written, but it's counterintuitive and undermines our faith. And I'll explain later why this approach isn't just bad storytelling. It might actually be pushing people away from Christ. First, we have to define what I mean by preachy.
Okay.
If you're a Christian filmmaker and you give more sermons than your pastor, we need to talk. The whole point of storytelling is to hook the audience into a story that moves them and takes them on a journey, not to...
So that's an interesting thing, actually, to think about then. Are you too focused on the message that you've not shown it in the story? It reminds me of a disagreement that... or kind of the approaches that 2 different Christian authors had. One was C.S. Lewis and one was J.R.R. Tolkien, both of them Christians. And they both wrote fantasy books talking about Christian values. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. And a lot of people would not know that is actually... a movie made by a Christian with Christian themes, but if you look in it, it's in there. The battle between good and evil, a hopeless battle. There's a lot of those themes within that. Then when you read C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia, it's very much in your face, especially Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is in your face, and the movie's in your face. This is a Christian movie. Aslan is Jesus. We got Lion Jesus. I mean, that's what it is. That's what it's talking about. So there's always kind of been this battle over having those messages, but also how much we want to make it obvious, let's say. How obvious do we want to make it that we're making a movie about Jesus? So there's an interesting conversation that you can have in that. Let's continue on. I want to see what else they're talking about.
cram the story with as many references to Jesus as possible. Conservative Christians have a bad reputation in film and media because we've turned stories into cinematic Sunday sermons. This is a direct contrast to how Jesus told his stories, which we'll get to in the next section. Before we dive into the film breakdowns, let's get clear on...
That's an interesting idea too, that Jesus used stories to portray the message instead of just always going at you.
On what forcing the gospel actually looks like, because once you see it, you won't unsee it. Namely, unrealistic, sudden, or cheesy conversion scenes, monologuing about Jesus or faith instead of showcasing real growth, pausing for a sermon to make a point, and minimal effort is put into creativity, or in other words, doing the bare minimum. Ready to cringe a little? Let's look at some of the most notorious examples of forced gospel messaging and why they fail on every level. God's Not Dead has been criticized into the ground, so instead, I'll discuss its sequel, God's Not Dead 2. Let's take a look.
I assume Ms. Wesley understands that this board has the power to recommend any number of disciplinary action.
I just realized I need to have headphones on. Amateur hour. Amateur hour. I bet that sounded horrible. My apologies.
Up to and including termination.
I may have a solution. A disciplinary notice stating the school board's objections, a response from Ms. Wesley confessing the inappropriateness of, along with a pledge not to engage in similar discussion of Jesus in the future.
The entire basis of this movie is that of a school teacher who is tried in court after mentioning Jesus in her class. The evil lawyer of the opposition states his objective.
Arkansas flag spotted. This would never have happened in Arkansas. That is a death wish for any judge in the state of Arkansas to do this case.
Clearly.
We're going to prove once and for all that God is dead.
Now I'm all for...
See, that's in, attorney, say that in Arkansas. I don't care where you're at, biggest city, dead, done, over.
A big and bad villain, but mainstream faith-based media has caricatured it in such a way that it comes off as very one-dimensional. In essence, they have mastered the art of making their audience feel seen and heard by way of speaking to their victimhood. In movies like these, the Christian is always the persecuted figure, always being trampled on, always a victim. This kind of writing encourages a victim mindset. While it's true Christians have been persecuted at one time or another, we are by no means persecuted in the modern world to the degree...
You know, I have some pastors. I'm going to go meet a friend of mine today who talked to me a lot about this, is that we in America over the last 30 years, I mean, we developed this kind of victim mentality for Christians, and we talk a lot about victim mentality in college, talk to a lot about young people, but it happens to Christians too, where we feel like we're under the pressure. And now, to some extent, we are. I work for a digital media company, and we get ads blocked by Google all the time because they're religious ads. And, we deal with stuff on social media. I witnessed firsthand as a pastor, Facebook not pushing churches as much after COVID, when a lot of churches got social media accounts. So it happens, but I feel like we're trying to make it that we're going through almost our own thing that happened in the 30s and 40s, H word that I can't say on stream. We're making it look like we're under that kind of oppression when we're not. We're not. We actually have it really good compared to most Christians nowadays, and we have a lot of freedom to talk about Christianity, and there's some confines that we have to walk in and I'm trying to get around them a lot of the time too, don't get me wrong, but we definitely have this that exists in Protestant Christian culture where we want to look like this oppressed people.
The early church was. For that matter, third world countries have more persecution than we do in our comfortable lives in the West. So while portraying reality is applicable, encouraging Christians to act like victims and treat every possible conflict as public enemy number one is not. How do you think that affects their interactions in the day-to-day? Most non-believers I've met aren't bothered by our faith, simply because they aren't the caricatured version we find in faith-based movies. The atheists in these movies are made this way to make the moms and older demographic feel good about themselves.
It's true.
And obviously so. The bad guy is always spelled out, as if the audience isn't smart enough to read between the lines. But what happens when you keep
That's one of the things about the writing is that there's often not a lot of complexity between these characters. And also one thing I found with the atheist, especially in the first God's Not Dead movie, is that you find that these atheists actually kind of do believe in God. They actually do believe in God, but it's just that they're angry at him for some reason. And that's like not just God's Not Dead, but that's like a lot of them where atheists are actually closeted believers in God, but they're just angry for some reason. And I've met some very genuine atheists in my life. I've met a lot of genuine atheists in my life. And I've met a lot of people that they portray in Christian movies too that are just so caught up in life and in struggle and trauma that they just have never gained a relationship with God. They've never worked toward that.
Food feeding the audience like this. You train them to stop thinking. And that's where the real damage begins. The second scene is from Saving Christmas, directed by Darren Doan and starring Kirk Cameron.
No.
That's Christmas. Don't, dude. I love your sister. I love her to death. She loves doing this. She loves putting all the lights up and.
Smoot Tariff Act, which
But I look.
anyone
I
raised
look
or
at what
lowered
Christmas is.
raised tariffs in an
think to
effort to
myself,
collect more revenue for the federal government. Did
this
it work?
cannot
Anyone know the effects?
What God wants.
This scene has two shots, both facing the two characters. No creative angles.
One thing it's important to point out, though, is that I'm going to tilt the camera a bit. One thing to point out is just that often these movies are super low budget. And one thing, if you read a lot of the news, a lot of Christian television stations are struggling with money. And just even like the bigger ones, like Pure Flix, Great American, they merged. They just don't have a lot of money to put forward. A lot, but they want to make profit. They can't afford to do what Disney does and put out big movies and lose money. They need to make a profit. And so often that's when you find yourself making these cheap Hallmark-esque Christian movies that are cheap to make. The actors are cheap, but they have some name recognition, like Kirk Cameron, pretty well-known actor, has a show on TBN now. But like so then you have a core group of audience too, the older people, the Christian soccer moms who are going to watch this. So it's like you made it cheap and you're guaranteed probably going to make your money back. And even if you didn't, then like you're only going to lose a little bit of money, but chances are you're going to make your money back. And if this has the chance of like taking off on like Netflix or whatever, or cheap DVD sales, then you're probably going to make in the long run quite a bit of money off a really cheap movie. But then you get these cheap camera cuts like this. The lighting is just horrible. The audio is like not mixed well, and you can tell where they were just doing this in a few shots, trying to do it quickly instead of doing 28 shots to get the perfect shot.
No flashbacks, no shots to give context to the environment. To add insult to injury, the acting has no character to it either. It's bland, and if you're like me, you started to tune out as you were watching it. This is very simply a lack of creative effort. That is not because, as some commenters have told me, that Christians are out of creative juice. Far from it. It's because the focus was on conveying a message, and a bland one at that. It's not interesting even in the slightest, and that stings for me to say about fellow Christians. At the same time, we cannot continue to tolerate this lack of creative effort. In Scripture, when we read that God had the Israelites build the tabernacle and craft the priestly garments, they were pleasing to the eye, wrought with gold and fine gems. On top of that, when I took the time to study human anatomy, I was amazed at all the intricate systems and details God has made within our bodies. It's simply awe-inspiring to behold. This is the God we serve, not the bland, tasteless creativity we see in faith-based movies. Our God is a God of beauty, and by making ugly, uninteresting movies, we are spitting in the face of how He designed art to be, because He creates works of art, and faith-based movies are sermons.
Reminds me of a discussion we had a lot in seminary about buildings. And, I was very much like from the Protestant evangelical background of, just make it a place of worship, make it functional. Functionality was my number one thing. And I disagree with a lot of my friends who came from Catholic backgrounds who had these crazy, amazing buildings that cost, untold fortunes, some of them, especially the ones in Italy. But, as I got older, I came not to critique that as much as a waste of money, but I actually began to see it in itself as an act of worship. And that's a lot of he's talking about here, about not just functionality, not just stuff that works, not just a message, but the art and storytelling of how you get behind that in Christian books and movies.
Not art. And here's the tragic irony. Saving Christmas didn't fail because of budget. It failed because the story came last. And when you put story last, everything else falls apart. But here comes a curveball. A Christian film that looks amazing and almost gets it right, until it doesn't. Introducing Miracles of Heaven. Let's take a look.
When Anna got sick, I just couldn't understand it. Why was this devoted, God-loving little girl going through this? I was angry that our prayers weren't being answered. I lost my faith. Albert Einstein said there are only two ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, and the other is as
I used to fall into this too. I don't really know what Albert Einstein's faith was like. That'll be another
though
video.
everything is a miracle. Miracles are everywhere.
Now, the first thing that probably stuck out to you is, this is really well produced. I think this
Really
already
good
proves
actors
my
in it.
point that Christians are 110% fully capable of making well-crafted movies.
We are.
But here's where this movie falls short. The message. This cute little speech made here feels hand-tailored for believers and believers alone. I think that's all well and dandy, but when that
speaking in
comprises
church.
all of the
No.
movies we've made, there's an issue. One critic
joke.
says,
That's
to have
totally
it
a
suddenly, blatantly preach to the converted and to the converted alone is a missed opportunity of massive proportions. And here's the question we all need to ask. If every Christian movie is only meant for Christians, then what exactly is the mission? What makes zero sense to me is that, as the critics before mentioned, we are preaching to converted audiences. This is echo chamber.
And that's how a lot of our churches are. Songs that speak to Christians who are already saved. Sermons designed to get amens and approval from people in the crowd and not really reach people who are struggling. So this is just a movie thing. This is, we make songs for saved people. We make messages for saved people. And yet, I would say our number one priority Jesus gave us is to reach people who are not saved.
Evangelism. Why are we trying to convert people who already know Christ? Not only does it make no sense, but it alienates non-believers as well. Its feel-good message is only there to make the faith-based audience feel good about themselves. Get a yes and amen out of your audience, and that's your job done. But here's the real kicker. None of this works. And the reason why might not be what you think. Audiences aren't dumb. They know when they're being preached to. It's obvious and induces eye-rolling every time. And it's not because they just don't get it, or we need to preach the gospel because Jesus told us to. It's because you're treating your audience like they're robots. There's a difference between having a strong message and preaching, which disrupts the story's rhythm, prioritizing messaging over the characters, conflict and resolution, emotions, but it doesn't. This next part might surprise some of you. God doesn't just tolerate storytelling. He chooses it as his primary method of communication. Up to 70% of the Bible is comprised of visual imagery, narrative, and story. The Bible isn't a book of systematic theology. It's God's love letter to us, and his primary way of communicating is through visual narrative. If that's not convincing enough, Jesus himself told stories. Some people misunderstand these as hyper-literal analogies that have no application to storytelling whatsoever. But the Bible has graphic, nuanced, and layered narratives. Take this parable as an example, and pay attention to the verses highlighted in red. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And he laid hands on him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison, till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry, and delivered him to the torturers, until he should pay all that was due to him. This parable is a visceral illustration of what happens to those who are self-righteous and unforgiving of others. Jesus simply could have said, Forgive those who do evil to you, or there will be consequences. But instead, he takes the time to hook his audience in with a story that has emotional gravity to it. Verse 34 is the most haunting. The wicked servant is not simply punished, but he is delivered to the torturers to be mutilated until he pays his debt. Storytelling leaves a lasting impression where words are forgotten. The Bible is not just a source book for theology, it's a visual narrative with truth layered into it. Storytelling is powerful, and the truth is magnified when it is woven into a masterful narrative. That's why Jesus used parables and fictional stories as his primary method of teaching. They cause you to use your imagination and experience it firsthand. God created us to be creative as he is, which means having the ability to tell stories through music and the visual arts.
And I think that's such an important message to take away, that we don't just need to give in to the echo chamber of Christianity, of just playing the same songs, doing the same thing, being in the same routine. We need to be creative. We need to be different. We need to figure out how we can honor God and do the best that we can in anything that we do. Not just good enough on songs, because it's what we're used to doing. Not just good enough on sermons, because it's what we're used to doing. Not just bad movies. I'm going to relax some movies sometime. But, it's about giving God what he deserves. And that is giving God our best. Short stream today, headed out somewhere. I will see y'all later. Peace.